Hi, everybody. I'm Anne Mohanraj. I'm trying to get into the screen and also be able to show you both the spices, but also I'll be working over here. So I'm going to move back and forth a little bit. Hopefully that will work. My plan for today is to talk you through what goes into making your own spice blend. And specifically, I'm going to be teaching you how to make a Sri Lankan spice blend, which involves an extra step. We roast the spices in advance. So the reason we do that, it changes the flavor. Not all of our spice blends are roasted, but pretty commonly people will. And if you think about dark roasting coffee, you can, I think, get a pretty quick sense of what that might look like and taste like. So hang on, I think I have to take this poll too. I'm going to say 1. Okay. All right. So, I'm going to get started, but in my day job, I'm a professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And so I am very used to fielding questions in the classroom and I love them. So I can also talk at length on my own. So I'll fill the time, but I really want to encourage you all, if you have any questions at any point during this process, don't hesitate to jump in and ask them. So I think you can turn on video if you want or not, but I think you can also just speak. At the moment, the view I have set up, I can only see the librarian. So, but I'm assuming I'll be able to hear you. I'm guessing you can maybe also put questions in the chat, and those can be relayed to me. So, all right, let's get started. So the spices I'm going to use, this is how I use spices in such quantity that I have these giant jars of spices, at least of the South Asian spices. So to make this, we're going to use coriander, cumin seed, fennel seed, fenugreek, which is also called methi seed, and then cinnamon stick, cloves, and cardamom pods and cloves. So those are the main ingredients. We don't roast all of them. We roast the first 4. So I'm going to start on that because we roast it kind of slowly. And so it would be pretty boring if you just had to sit and watch while I roasted for half an hour. So my plan is to roast and talk at the same time. So we'll see how that goes. Okay, so first, a cup of coriander. We use more coriander in this particular curd powder than any of the other spices. It's a really solid base. One of the great things about making your own spice blends is that you can adjust it to your taste. So I have a friend who was telling me actually just yesterday that her mom can't stand curry, and specifically it's cumin. She just really dislikes cumin. If you make your own spice blend, you can leave the cumin out. So, and you know, there is not any standard blend, right? You may be familiar with something like the Indian garam masala, but even that varies from place to place, is my understanding. I'm not an expert on Indian food. And certainly Sri Lankan curry powders, you know, it's going to be a little different from, you know, every house, right? As you go. My mom is the oldest of 9 children, 8 girls and 1 boy, and everyone makes their dishes a little differently, their spices a little differently, and then we get together and we argue about whose is best. So my mother's was usually the best, I think. So there's going to be a temptation when you're roasting spices to dump them all in together and roast them to save time. You don't want to do that, because if you try to do that, what will happen is that some of them will burn while others are not yet roasted. They roast at different speeds. So you really do have to do them individually. This is a great thing to do while you're watching a TV show, or my daughter is almost 15. I have assigned her to do it, and she will be watching TikTok on her phone while roasting spices. So it's a kind of like pleasant meditative task. You don't have to roast, you don't have to stir constantly, but you do have to keep an eye on it. And I usually do it on medium heat if you try and do it on high, there's a good chance it's going to burn. So I wouldn't recommend it. Even medium high is kind of tricky. Low is probably not necessary. So the coriander is going to go for a little while. While that's going, before we move on to other things, I can tell you a little bit more about, let me think. I'll tell you a little bit more about what these different spices are good for. I don't know if good for is exactly the right word, but one element of this is that there's supposedly a whole host of healing properties to different spices, right? And there's an entire South Asian medicine tradition, Ayurvedic medicine, which I don't know a lot about. My family is actually all Western doctors, except for me. And my understanding is that so far, there has not been very much sort of peer-reviewed, double-blind studies of Ayurvedic medicine practices. However, there's some aspects of it that very clearly do correspond. So for example, if any of you watching this have ever been pregnant, you might be familiar with fenugreek. You might have encountered it as a powder. So fenugreek, let's see if I can get this very visible to you. Let's see, there we go, maybe. That's fenugreek seeds, also called methi seeds. Fenugreek is a potent, what's called a galactagogue, right? Which means something that increases milk production in nursing mothers. And so if a mom is having trouble producing milk, she can go to the health food store and get fenugreek powder. Doctors will prescribe this. So in Sri Lanka, what would happen is that after you have a baby, people would make you curries with lots that were just loaded with fenugreek, right? And lots of coconut milk, a little lighter on the spices, maybe than normal, on the heat, the chili, even the onion, the garlic, they might pull back on the sort of fiery heating spices and go for something more soothing, just so it doesn't, potentially irritate the baby's developing system. And so you'd get this rich, milky curry, and there was a saying, milk to bring the milk, right? And so that's just an example of one of the ways in which these different spices can have a physiological effect. There are a lot of claims out there for what all these different spices can do. Turmeric, for example, if you run into like yellow milk or turmeric milk, it's become a sort of faddish thing, and there's a whole bunch of health claims around it. And it is certainly a part of, it's sometimes called golden milk, and it is certainly a part of Ayurvedic medicine. You may now see it at places like Starbucks. I'm not sure if it's made it to Starbucks yet, but it's definitely showing up in some major cities in the US. So that's one of the ones that people have a lot of health claims about. I have not vetted any of that, so I'm not going to pretend that I know which of these will do particularly healthy things for you, but you can Google it and see how it comes. So, and make your own decisions. Or check with your doctor is probably what my sisters would want me to tell you. So before you start ingesting anything, and keeping in mind that, if often the danger is ingesting things in large quantities. Even something as simple as spices, nutmeg, right, that many people are really used to using all the time without any trouble, it's poisonous if you take it in sufficiently large quantities. So you just want to be a little bit careful with spices as sort of health food supplements, which are generally not regulated in the same way that food is here. Right. I'm pausing now. I'm stirring. I wish you could smell what it smells like in my kitchen, because it smells terrific. As this starts roasting, it is releasing some very nice scent. And I'm going to bring that over in a little bit so you can see the color change once it actually starts changing. I should make sure you know that when you're doing spice roasting, it will get very scented. Now, my mom was an immigrant. We came to the US when I was 2.5. And she was certainly very concerned when we were in apartment buildings growing up that, our food, the scents might bother people. And so she always had the exhaust fan going. Once we were in a house, she might even cook outside, which of course in Sri Lanka, people often did cook outside because it was hot. So you might have, an outside of sort of stove set up with a fire that you could cook on that was going to be more pleasant than trying to cook inside the house on a very hot day. But when she cooked at home, she'd always keep the kitchen door closed so that the scent would not get into the rest of the house. And I feel like that is often a first generation immigrant concern. For me, I love the scent. When my friends come over and they smell it, it's, they're like, oh, you made curry powder today, right? It fills the room, fills the house kind of for a day. And then it dissipates. When you make this, you roast the curry powder, you grind it, you put it in a container and you give it to somebody. When they open it, for quite a while afterwards, it's going to have a really strong, wonderful scent. So that's another sort of thing to be aware of if you decide you're going to roast your own curry powder. Okay.
Can I ask a quick question?
Please. I'm really not used to just talking and talking and talking. I'd much rather have a conversation.
So can you tell me where you get your spices at? Because sometimes they're difficult to find, and sometimes I find that they're very costly in the store, but there's other stores that you can go to and get them more reasonably priced. Like the fenugreek is hard to find.
Yes, so I'm going to give you a whole list of potential things. It used to be really hard for me to find spices in Chicago, and I would have to go all the way up to Devon to do it. It's gotten much easier. So here in Oak Park, our local Pete's actually has a really good selection of Indian spices. They have like 2 full shelves full of spices, and also a variety of lentils, various rices, pastes, etc. So on, like tamarind paste. They have the good coconut milk, etc. So on. So, so if you're in Oak Park, Pete's is a great option. If I'm going to be buying in bulk, which I'm often buying fairly large quantities because I sell batches of curry powder along with my cookbooks, I usually go to one of the Indian stores because prices are generally better there. There's a bunch up on Devon. If you go all the way up to Devon, I would say, I think Patel Brothers is pretty good. If you go there, I recommend you stop at Tahora, which is a sort of snack and sweet shop. Their samosas are fabulous. The sweets are great. You can get a tray of beautiful sweets and bring them to a party, and people will be very impressed. So you can, but if you don't want to go to Devon, and I'm actually not sure from Naperville, I'm not sure what's the closest option. For me,
there's a Patel Brothers in Naperville.
Yeah.
Okay, so that might be a great option. I'm not sure. I haven't done like a price comparison. I often go to Westmont, which has clearly has enough of a South Asian community South Indian community, that they carry all the spices I need, because Sri Lanka is near the southern tip of India, right? And so there's a lot of overlap between our cuisines. It's not the same, but there's overlap. And you can also get dosa batter and idli batter, and there are little snack shops in Westmont that where you can go and do your grocery shopping and then go over to Priya's and have some, dal and idli and have a nice afternoon of it. So the one that I usually go to is called A1 Indian Grocery. So if you're ever down that way, I was just there. I want to say it's 6001 South Cass Avenue. I'm pretty sure is the address. So it's a good, if you're going to Oak Brook to do some shopping, you can then just jaunt down another 15 minutes south and you'll hit that area. There's there's even some sari stores around there. So it's like a little mini South Indian neighborhood.
Sue,
So in Naperville, Patel Brothers is good. I get a lot of my spices there. 30 minutes down this road to get anything. But now Patel Brothers International Market on the corner of Ogden and 59. I do also get a bunch of spices from Penzies because it's guaranteed free, and I've got a good friend who has celiac.
Okay.
The small Indian grocery stores that you'll see, they're also good as well. So it's got.
And you said Penzies is guaranteed gluten-free on their spices?
They are, yes.
That's good to know because I have some gluten-free. Thank you.
Penzies is, I was going to talk about Penzies. They're a little more expensive, but they have beautiful spices. So I buy certain things from there because the flavor is so good that I'm willing to pay a little extra for it. So for example, black pepper, they sell different varieties of black pepper. I particularly like the Telecherry black pepper. It's just really strong, pungent, flavorful. It's delicious. So I'll pay a little bit more, and I don't go through black pepper that fast. So it'll last me a while. Similarly, I'm going to talk about cinnamon. I buy my cinnamon from Penzies usually because I feel like I'm willing to pay a little bit more for high quality cinnamon because it makes such a difference to the flavor. So one thing that is sort of unfortunate is that cardamom has gotten really expensive the last few years, and I'm not sure why. I think there must be some issues in South Asia that have been reflected in pricing. So I have a Sri Lankan friend who is bitterly complaining about what had happened to cardamom. So you may have to use it a little sparingly, but the good thing is that cardamom kind of goes a long way. It's a very, very strong spice. Okay, so the coriander is ready. So I'm gonna bring this over just so you can see, hopefully, the difference. Let's see if I can show you this. So this is the color of the coriander when it hasn't been roasted yet. Let's see if I can tilt it so it doesn't have the glass. Okay, so it's kind of a yellow, maybe like a slight greenish cast to it. And now here, I'm going to try lifting this stand, is the roasted version, which I think you can see is sort of a medium brown at this point. It's not perfectly even because I've been a little distracted talking to you, and my mother would look at this and make a little sound like, you know, like you could do better than this. I'm like, all right, but I'm teaching and cooking at the same time. So, you know, like have a little patience with me here. So, but this is basically right. You don't need to go super dark. I would say this is plenty. And you can smell how the scent has changed, how it's really giving that off in a beautiful way. So then I'm just gonna put this into a bowl for a moment, and then I'm gonna move on to spice number 2. I'm gonna roast 4 of them. The others will go, cumin will also take a little while. The last 2 go fast. They only take a few seconds to get roasted. Okay, so next is cumin, which is also used a lot in Mexican cooking. So I'm gonna put half a cup of cumin in here. Okay, and it's gonna start off almost a gray color, kind of like a little bit of brown, a little bit of gray. It's going to get much more tan brown as it roasts. Any other questions?
Okay, I've got a question. So when you're putting this together and you say that you change the different spices, do you do different ratios just depending on what you're cooking? You know?
So I don't. I have, you know, sort of over the years found a spice blend I like. And so I tend to just sort of stick with it.
Okay.
You certainly could. And if I were, you know, if I were having a guest who is allergic to cumin, for example, then I'd just leave it out. It would change the flavor a little bit, but not in a terrible way. It would just be slightly different. So I think, so when you do Sri Lankan cooking, so Sri Lankan cooking it's kind of a cross between Indian and Thai in flavor profile. And I'm sorry I can't send you to a Sri Lankan restaurant, As far as I'm aware, the closest one is in Minnesota. So it's an 8-hour drive. So if you'd like to taste it, you should learn how to make your own, probably, or drive to Minnesota. There's a ton of Sri Lankan restaurants in Toronto, and there are a few in New York. When we had the Civil War which lasted for a couple decades, lots of Sri Lankan Tamils left the country as refugees, including several members of my family. And Canada had much more open refugee policies than America did. And so they have a huge Sri Lankan refugee population that has now been there for 20 to 30 years. And as a result, there are a ton of great Sri Lankan restaurants in Toronto. So if you make it up to Canada, check them out. I recommend, there's a place called Hopper Hut, which was great last time I was there. So, okay, let's give this a stir. Okay, so what I was going to say about adjusting the flavorings is that, you know, the curry powder is sort of a base. When you start building a curry, what you're going to do is you do it in layers. So you heat some oil, you put in some mustard seeds, let those get heated to popping. That's going to, essentially you're making mustard oil, right? And then you add some cumin seeds, a whole cumin seed that you haven't roasted. And then usually you'll put in onions, ginger, garlic, and cook those, right? So that's a very sort of standard Sri Lankan base for most of our curries. At that point, it then starts to vary a lot depending on what kind of curry you're making. But if you are making one that uses curry powder, which not all of them do, you would then use, say, a teaspoon of curry powder, of this roasted curry powder, and that's going to give a certain depth of flavor, right? You are also probably going to add some whole spices. So if I were making, say, a chicken curry or a vegetarian jackfruit curry, which is follows a very similar preparation, I would do my little seasoned onion blend. Then I would add probably 3 whole cloves, 3 whole cardamom pods, maybe a cinnamon stick, and stir those whole spices in. And this is one of the things that I think can be a little bit tricky for Americans who are used to eating with a knife and fork, because biting into a whole cardamom pod accidentally because you've scooped it up in your fork with your rice is not super pleasant. And it's not something that happens to you if you're eating with your hands the way you would in Sri Lanka, right? Because you would notice that you've picked up a cardamom pod and you would put it to the side of your plate because it's not really meant to be eaten straight up. If you've never bitten into a cardamom pod, they're very strong. So if you are expecting that your guests are going to be eating with a fork, or your family will be eating with a fork, I would say one option is to, when you put the whole spices in, put them in cheesecloth, and probably you'd be simmering them in rather than sauteing them in, because later you're going to add some liquid to the dish generally. So other than that, or you can try to just fish them out individually before you serve it, or you can tell your guests, family, etc., that they just have to cook. So depending on what your approach is. It's not so bad biting into a cooked clove, and cooked cinnamon stick is fine. It's really the cardamom pods that people often are like, oh, that was very strong. And they're pretty big, and they're fairly easy to see and fish out.
So I have a question then. I mean, I have not cooked much in this regard. However, oftentimes they tell you to put your spices through a grinder. So when you're completed with this, are you going to grind the spices or?
Yes, we're gonna make a curry powder.
Okay.
So, but we also use whole spices. We will typically do both, and that's gonna they're gonna give you different flavor profiles because these are roasted and ground, and then the whole spices are fresh and not ground, right? So you actually are gonna get some layers of flavor that way. It's just, it becomes more complex. There's also a step, it's a little confusing because it's called tempering, which is not the same tempering as when you're tempering chocolate. So there's sometimes people get really confused by that if they're familiar with tempering chocolate in that process. In South Asia, when they talk about tempering spices, what they mean is this step where often in a separate pan, when you're almost done cooking, you'll heat up some oil and some whole spices, fry them for a few seconds, and then add those to the dish at the end, which again, like adding it at that point also changes the profile, right? So you're going to get a different set of flavors if you add those at the very end, as opposed to adding the whole spices before you simmer a curry for 30 minutes. So it's just, it ends up being a question of kind of what you're looking for, what the balance of freshness you want. Like, do you want more of a fresh bite of spices? Do you want more of a really well blended, simmered kind of effect? So, and traditionally different recipes have leaned in one way or another. But it's kind of all up to you. It's, you're the chef, you get to decide. And you get to do it how you like it. I really like tang. And so my best friend is also Sri Lankan and also cooks. And she and I, it's not that we argue exactly, but when she comes to eat at my house, she's always like, oh, you put so much lime juice and so much tamarind into things. And I'm like, but it tastes good. She's like, it's too much. And then when I go to her place, she puts in too much salt. I will tell her it's too much salt. She doesn't think so. But this is the individual chef and their preferences, right? Okay, so the cumin seed is getting there. It's not quite fully roasted yet, but it's almost there. I don't know if you can see, but the smoke is coming up. And I probably would have the exhaust fan on, except it's noisy. And I don't want you guys to have to listen to it. But if I were here on my own, I would probably have it on for this process. It's still going to smell like curry powder even with the exhaust on. So just be aware. Okay, I'm trying to think. So, all right, I was talking through the layering of the dish. So you do the seasoned onions. Before you add the ground curry powder is usually when you would put in the heat. So if you are using, I think in my cookbook, I usually say cayenne because that's easy for Americans to find, kind of even if you're in the heart of the Midwest, you can usually find cayenne. But I use what is usually labeled as like extra hot chili powder in the Indian grocery store. And it's bright red. It's a bright red powder. It's very strong. I like things pretty hot. So, but this is another area where I think people get confused because people sort of think like, oh, I'll often run into people who will. I've actually taken this off the heat because it was starting to get too roasted, and I was like, okay, I gotta take it off before it burns. And I'm gonna stir for a second just to make sure that it is done. So let me transfer that into something else. One sec. It can go from like cooked in an instant, so you have to keep a little bit of an eye on it. The last two go fast. So before we get to that, I'll just finish what I was saying. So the people will often think that all Indian food is spicy, right? And it just isn't, right? You get to control the heat level. And in any given family, people will have spice level preferences. So my middle sister doesn't like a lot of heat in her dishes. She'll put in some, but not very much. And there are people in Sri Lanka who like no heat at all. You can just leave the cayenne, the chili pepper out, right, entirely, and that doesn't make it inauthentic. I mean, if you were going to make a specific dish that was meant to be hot, like a vindaloo, right, a South Asian vindaloo, that is supposed to be tangy and hot, right? That's like the defining characteristics of that dish. But if you were making a chicken curry, you can vary it to your preferred heat level. What I found when I was traveling in Sri Lanka is that if I went to restaurants that typically serve tourists, so the hotel restaurants, the 4- and 5-star hotel restaurants, everything was fairly mild. It was actually kind of hard to get a hot spicy dish. If I went to local restaurants, things would be generally a little hotter. But when I went to my aunt's house, tears were streaming down my face because she liked it hot, and that was how she cooked it. That's how her family enjoyed eating it, and that was what she served me. So, and I like that. I just wasn't quite prepared for it because I'd been eating in Sri Lanka for 3 weeks, and I had not realized that it was going to get that much hotter. But it was great. So, so what you would do is you'd add the cayenne, and it's called like raw red chili powder on the packet, because it's just been ground, and it could use a little tempering. So when you heat you've got this heated oil, you put the chili powder in and you stir it for 30 seconds maybe, it'll change color and it'll change flavor. You wouldn't want to, it is better if you have that step of frying it in oil for a little bit, as opposed to just like adding more chili at the end into a pot of soup or something like that. And I hope that made sense. It really is kind of a sequence, right, to get the best effect. And it's a very simple sequence. It's not, there's nothing particularly hard about any of these steps, but you kind of just want to be sure you hit all the steps as you go. So I think people sometimes get intimidated because they're like, oh, there's so many ingredients. But it's not that they're particularly difficult techniques or anything like that, right? Like tempering chocolate, I've done it. I find it a little tricky, right? Or sometimes my husband will make a souffle, and I have not even attempted that. I will do it at some point. But so there's some things where, like, or I made meringues last week. I made rose cardamom meringues, and they came out beautifully. And then the next day was high humidity, and they all collapsed. I had not stored them yet, and so I was like, so they're actually still, I don't know if you can see them in here, but they're here, and I'm eating them, but they're chewy, which meringues are not supposed to be. So I feel like Sri Lankan food, when you're building a curry, it's mostly a sequence, and as long as you don't burn anything, you're probably okay. There's a lot of room for variation. All right, I'm going to do the last two. So fennel, you don't use as much. Fennel looks like, if you haven't used it, it looks like cumin seed. Let's see, trying to get this into the right spot there. Okay, so that's fennel. The seeds are bigger, they're more green, but the really significant thing is they smell like licorice. So you bring it out and it's immediately a strong licorice scent. It's delicious. I really like fennel. So we would typically probably put a little more fennel, whole fennel, in if you were making something like a fish curry. Often might have a little more fennel or fennel. So this, I'm not going to try to like manage the iPad at the same time as I'm doing this, but it's already changing color. So it's going to be maybe 30 seconds, and then it'll be brown enough that I want to take it off. I'm going to get the plate ready so I have something to put it on. And the scent has changed already. It's gone from the fresh licoricey scent to something that is a little more toasted, I guess is I think what I would say. It's more of a toasted scent now. Toasted licorice. Delicious toasted licorice. Okay. Did I burn it? I think that's good. So it is now still got a hint of green to it, but more of a light brown. And the last one we're toasting is the fenugreek, which I'm putting in a teaspoon of fenugreek. So again, you can vary these proportions, but it was what I use is a cup of coriander, a half cup of cumin seed, tablespoon of fennel seed, and a teaspoon of fenugreek. You don't have to remember all that. If you go to my cooking blog, which is Serendib Kitchen, the recipe for curry powder is there. So you can just look at it. So, and this is already toasting. Like I put it in, and in the time I sent that to you, half of everything that was touching the bottom of the pan had turned dark. And do this. I just shake it because it's the best way to get these even, as opposed to stirring it. So I'll do that a couple times, and then that'll be ready to come off. And then we grind. So any questions at this point? Pausing for questions.
I don't have any questions right now.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Marianne, are there differences in the way you make your spice blend compared to your sisters or your mother? Like, is there something you add more or less of?
You know, I think so. When I was working on the cookbook, there was a whole sequence that goes with this cookbook, right? So what happened is that the first time I wrote a Sri Lankan cookbook, I was very young. I was in my early 20s, and I did it as a Christmas present from my mom. And I wrote down all the recipes of hers that I knew at that point. And I gave them, and I had a friend who had a small press who was interested in publishing it. So they published it for me. But really, it was not anything we were planning to sell a lot of copies of. It was mostly to be a gift from my mom. And I gave it to her that Christmas. And she starts going through, and her comments were like, well, you got that wrong. You got that wrong. And so then I started threatening. I was like, I'm going to make you go through this with red pen, and then we're going to issue a second edition with Amma's corrections in red all the way through. But she did not agree to do that. I think it would have been great. But she didn't go for it. So alas, that will never see the light of day. But then many years go past, right? So that was in my early 20s, and that book did end up getting used by a lot of my cousins. Actually ended up buying it, my second cousins and so on, because as immigrant kids, they had grown up eating the food, but they often had not learned how to cook it. And my mom didn't teach me to cook when I was living at home. It was actually, I went off to college, and after, I don't know, 2 months of dorm food, I called her up and like begged her, Amma, please, can you tell me how to make something, that tastes good? And so she talked me through how to make my favorite dish at the time was her beef and potato curry. So she talked me through that over the phone, and I wrote everything down, and then I made it over and over and over again with rice, or I would eat it with bread. And that was the only thing I knew how to cook, right? Like, and I didn't even get that right all the time. There was one time when I was kind of I think I had started the rice going, and then I got distracted and like wandered down the hall to talk to somebody in another room. And the next thing I knew, the fire alarm was going off. The entire dorm, which I went to the University of Chicago, so this is the Shoreland, if anyone knows it, out by the lake, is this renovated hotel. So it's huge. It's 12 stories, probably 1,000 students live there. So they emptied the entire dorm, and it turned out that I had forgotten the rice. It had cooked on low for so long that all the water had evaporated off and turned what was left looked like lava. It was like this black pitted thing, and it filled everything with smoke. So I am really lucky that they did not hit me with a huge fine. So that was my initial cooking thing. And then over the years, I added some stuff to it. What I would do is I would go home, and she would, I'd ask her to teach me another dish for I'd be home for Christmas or the summer, and she would start cooking. My mom is a perfectionist. She would have been great in a French cooking school, right? She would come over, like when I was growing up at home, she would only let me chop onions, and she would come over and say, they're not small enough, they're not even. I don't know if you've ever seen the French cutting boards that have like the measurements on them of like, ½ inch, ¼ inch, 1/8 of an inch, etc. Right? Like that very, very precise style of cooking. My mom would have been all over that. And she was not a very patient teacher. And so what would end up happening, turn off the stove. What would end up happening was that she would start cooking, and she would like open a jar, reach in, grab the appropriate amount, throw it in the pot. And I was like, wait, Amma, how much was that? And she was like, I don't, like she doesn't measure anything, right? And so what I ended up having to do is literally like take my hands and cup them over the pot. and she would throw it into my hands. I would take it over, measure it, and then put it in the pot. And I had to do that over and over again. So this was this was back in 1993-ish, somewhere around there, right? And so pre-internet, right? I mean, there was a little internet, but not very much at this point, pre the World Wide Web. So there was no looking up recipes. She had one Sri Lankan cookbook, the Sri Lankan Daily News. And there's a great cookbook by Charmaine Solomon, who is Sri Lankan, but it's called the Complete Asian Cookbook, and she covers something like 13 countries. And everything I've made out of there has turned out great. So, I mean, her Sri Lankan section is spot on, but also like I've made some of her Indonesian dishes and some of her Korean dishes, and they're all delicious. So that's my cookbook recommendation to you guys. Charmaine Solomon, Complete Asian Cookbook. She has a lot of cookbooks out there, I think. She did this for a long time. So then a long time passed. I had kids. I had my daughter in 2007 when I was 35, my son in 2009. And then when I was 37, and then at 43, I was on a routine mammogram. They caught breast cancer. I'm fine now. But when I got the diagnosis, I was very freaked out. And the immediate thought in my head was, well, my children are 5 and 7, and I'm not going to, what if I'm not around to tell them everything I want to tell them? And my husband is white. And as I said, their closest Sri Lankan restaurant is 8 hours away. And I'm like, they're not going to know the food. They're not going to have access to it. And so I then went through chemo and surgery and radiation and the whole year of treatment, and it was awful, but also mostly tedious more than anything else. And then a year of follow-up infusions. But as I think it was that following summer that I found myself obsessively cooking Sri Lankan food, and specifically trying to write down the recipes. And I did a lot of research, my training as an academic, I did a master's and a PhD. So like, I know how to read books and like take notes, right? And so, so I would go look at dozens of recipes for a classic chicken curry, and then kind of like make an amalgam of like, well, I think this would taste good, and that sounds terrible. And then I'd try making it, and sometimes I'd get it right first time. Sometimes I'd have to make it 5 times before I was happy with it. And there are a couple of things that take specific techniques that I would honestly say I still haven't mastered. So things like string hoppers, or hoppers, or pittu, these are all starch things that you would make instead of rice. They're often rice-based. Our Sri Lankan cuisine is very gluten-free friendly because it's mostly rice-based. We don't do a lot of wheat. So the one thing that I would say is that I can make them. I made them well enough once in a while to be able to take a good photograph, and I know what the technique is supposed to be, and I can write it down. But it's sort of like when you're making pancakes, and the first pancake comes out wonky, kind of no matter what you do. But eventually you can make a string of really good looking pancakes. I'm not quite there with some of these, but most of them. I'm sorry, I think I've lost track of the question. The question was something about, oh, my sisters and my mom. So I would say for the curry powders and the recipes, we make them all differently, and we sort of tend to make it to our own taste. And then, what will happen at a family event is, we have a big family, often lots of people come. My mom would throw birthday parties for us, and 200, expatriate Sri Lankans would come, right? And everyone would bring dishes, so the burden didn't all fall on her to cook, and especially her sisters. And so then everybody eats, but there was always I don't know what it's called, like after the event where you sit and do the critique session, right? So that was a very standard part of growing up, where we'd be sitting around, everyone's eating, everyone's full, sometimes overfull. And then is the conversation about like, oh, Mara Auntie's milk toffee, it's always the best. She does such a good job with it. I don't know what it is. Or, you know, and often it's, if there's critique, it often comes from the person who cooked it. Like, oh, I put too much salt in the whatever this time, right? So, and then maybe people reassure you it's fine, or maybe they're like, yeah, you put too much salt in, right? So, because honest critique is a form of love as well. So, all right. I hope I answered the question. I think I went off on a little bit of a rambling tangent, but I want to talk about cinnamon. So if you have more questions, let me know. But I have two kinds of cinnamon here. So let's see. Yeah. I want to show you them. Sorry, the other kind is kind of buried down at the bottom, I think. I think that very bottom, it's the bad cinnamon. So I don't have very much of it, but okay. So let's see if I can show you the difference. So what you are probably familiar with is actually Cassia cinnamon. That's what's much more readily available in the US. And sorry, I'm trying to figure out where the camera is. It looks like this, right? Tightly curled, very hard and thick. And it's like one big tight curl, okay? What we use, preferably, we'll use Cassia if we can't get the good stuff, but we use Ceylon cinnamon. Ceylon is one of the older names for Sri Lanka. Ceylon tea, probably you've heard of, and which is also known as true cinnamon. And it looks like this. So if you can see, there's lots of thin layers, also tightly packed, but they're much thinner, flakier. The flavor is just better. So it is a little more expensive, I think. Cassia is cheap and easy to find everywhere. But I think this tastes so much better. I don't know. I have Cassia as sort of like a backup emergency in case I run out of Ceylon cinnamon. But the scent is, yeah. So like when I smell this Cassia, I can almost not smell anything. And this is like just hitting you with this incredible scent right away. And then the flavor is both more delicate, more fragrant. It's lovely. So I would recommend it for, you know, I mean, if you're baking something and it's got a lot of other stuff going on and the cinnamon is only one tiny component of it and you need just a little bit of ground cinnamon, any ground cinnamon is probably going to be fine. Right? But if you're making a curry where the cassia is going to be a major, not the cassia, the cinnamon is going to be a major component and you really want that aromatic scent, then that's where I would say it's worth using the true Ceylon cinnamon instead. If you are having trouble telling the difference, because I know that I'm not sure how clear the video, what me holding this up was, but if you Google Cassia cinnamon versus Ceylon cinnamon, you will and do like an image search, a bunch of images will show up that'll pop up that'll very clearly show the differences. Or if you do a web search, they'll talk about the different characteristics. And they do have different enzymes and different, so if you're interested in, you know, the healing properties and so on, they do function somewhat differently. So I was looking at a site, Helpline, I think, was trying to talk about the specifics of the differences, and it was quickly more than I needed to know. But that's something you could think about. For grinding, it's easier to grind true cinnamon as well, right? Like, so if you're using, whether you're using a mortar and pestle or a coffee grinder, the coffee grinder will often like get caught on the big hard pieces of Cassia cinnamon, whereas this is very flaky and just like super easily just breaks, right? You can crumble it in your fingers. Okay. So now it's pretty straightforward. At this point, I'm breaking up the cinnamon stick and adding it to this. And then I'm going to add cardamom seeds and cloves. And because again, I make it in large quantities, I typically buy little bags of cardamom seeds where they've already taken the seeds out of the pods for me. So, but you don't have to. Like if you're you can just take a cardamom pod, break it open, and these little black seeds will come out, and that's what you would use for this. And then you can discard the rest of the pod, or you can keep it as a little flavor and you can throw it into something. Questions so far while I'm breaking up my cinnamon? They're all good.
Do you put a couple sticks in there, or just kind of
one stick? One stick should be
one
enough.
stick? And
Yeah.
then for cardamom pods, how many do you usually break up?
Well, you know, let me check because I'm like looking at my recipe. So it's a teaspoon, a rounded teaspoon of cardamom seeds. So I'm trying to think how many pods up. It's probably a fair number of pods. So this is another thing where if whole pods are expensive and you're going to do this often, you might want to actually buy the little packets of cardamom seeds. And in fact, I just bought some. I can tell you what the pricing is. All right. So one bag of Lakshmi cardamom seeds is from A1 Grocers is $6.99. But that is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, maybe 12 batches of curry powder out of one of these packets, right? So that's going to last you a pretty long time. And again, I keep it in my little jars like this. I can show you how to break one apart. That is helpful. You know, so here's pod, right? And you literally can just put it in a mortar and pestle and pound it a little bit, and the seeds come out. And actually, a fair number of seeds. I got like 10 seeds, 12 seeds. Very hard to show you this. Okay, there's a bunch of little seeds in there, and then I took away the pod shells. So maybe 5 to 10 pods, I think, should be enough. It's a little hard to say precisely for this. And again, this is going to make a batch of curry powder that will last you for several dishes. So it's not like you're doing all of this for one dish. Okay. So I'm adding a rounded teaspoon of the cardamom seeds, and then I'm going to put in some whole cloves. And I have to say, the Penzeys cloves are really good. Another place I buy spices, if you're coming to Oak Park, they have some beautiful spices we have a little food co-op, Sugar Beet, on Oak Park Avenue near Madison. And they get in, I want to say, I'm not sure what the brand is, maybe Frontier, but I bought cloves from them a couple of years ago before the pandemic when we were about to do a spice grinding demo, and I wanted to try out their spices. So I bought a whole bunch of spices there. They were all good, but their cloves were particularly beautiful. They were big. They didn't have many broken pieces. If you've ever done things like cloved oranges at the holidays, they were perfect for that because you didn't have to like dig through a bunch of substandard cloves to find enough decent ones to use for making cloved oranges. They were all beautiful. So probably is not so important for this kind of thing. But if you ever need pretty cloves, you might want to go there. Okay, so I've now put everything in this bowl to mix it up. I do a lot of cooking with my clean hands, but you could certainly use a spoon if you would rather. Or a fork, whatever you like. And then the next step is the grinding, and then we're basically done. You can do it with a mortar and pestle. So if you were going to do that, let's see if I can move this other stuff out of the way. You would do it in batches. You put some in, and then you would just do this, right? You just grind, and it would take a while. I find this a little tedious, but I guess it's also sort of satisfying. So if you enjoy mortar and pestling, go for it. But you do want a fairly fine grind at the end. So it's going to take a long time. Certainly in Sri Lanka, that's what they would use, although they probably would not use a little one like this. At my grandmother's house, what they had was, I want to say it was like this big around, this huge stone pestle, I guess is what it was. But it was low to the ground, like about knee height. And then the mortar, I'm getting these names right. Wait, which is the mortar, which is the pestle? I actually don't know. I may have gotten them switched. Because now I'm sort of like, maybe this is the pestle. Anyway, the sticky bit was huge. It was like, I want to say 3 feet tall and thick like this, right? And what they would do is they'd put whatever they're going to grind in the big thing. And then they'd pick up this big, heavy piece of stone and they would slam it down and it would bounce, right? And then they'd catch it and slam it again. So I work out with a trainer, and there's, say it's maybe kettlebells. There are these things they have you use at the gym where you slam it down and it bounces up again. And then you do that over and over, and it's tiring but good. But it's funny to me because it's the same motion that they use in Sri Lanka with these giant mortars and pestles. I'm sure if you go on YouTube, somebody will have a video of people doing that. It's pretty impressive to watch. And of course you can grind a lot of spices quickly that way. But that said, that was in my grandmother's time. I don't know how common that still is if you're not maybe out in the villages, because, you know, in the city, people have electric ovens and so on. And they are probably more likely, at least some of the time, to do what I do, which is I use a coffee grinder. And it's, you know, it's one that I keep one dedicated for spices because it's just too annoying to clean it otherwise if I were going to try to use it for coffee. So I'd pretty much only use it for this purpose, but you certainly could just clean it in between things if you are not making batches of curry powder every week the way I do. So, and this is going to get very loud. Sorry. Basically, yeah. Stop it. It'll take a little while to get through the whole thing, but okay, that's weird. I didn't do anything. Let me try that again. Did everyone somebody mess with my settings? Okay, so sometimes your coffee grinder breaks and then it just fails. So I'm gonna have to but I have packets that I made up a couple days ago. So I will show you what it's supposed to look like. What should happen is like 30 seconds later, you should have a nice grind of curry powder that looks like this, just like a powder, right? So if you can see the difference, there's the roasted spices and there's the ground batch. And I guess this is, you know, in some ways this is a good lesson. If you make lots and lots and lots of ground spices, you will probably burn out the motor on your grinder, which I suspect is what happened. This is maybe my 3rd grinder over, you know, many batches of making curry powder. So I wouldn't expect it to happen super fast, but it's certainly something to be aware might happen. And so it's good to have a backup mortar and pestle just in case, so that you are not left without curry powder. I would say once you made it, it will keep for quite a while. If you want to keep it even longer, you could keep it in the fridge, but honestly, it should be good for several months, if not, you know, a year. It'll become a little less aromatic over time, but it takes months, honestly, before that happens. Any questions at this point? I can talk a little bit more about sort of Sri Lankan food influences and the cuisine, but I just want to be sure that I answer any questions you have about the actual spice roasting, mixing, grinding process before I wander off onto another topic.
I'm fine with you talking about the food. It sounds great.
Okay. Okay. So we now have some curry powder, and then how are we on time? Hold on 1 second. 8:05. Okay. So so Sri Lanka, right, was settled originally in the 4th century BC by, so I'm going to go way back, by people from northern India, the Sinhalese, who are no longer, there aren't any in India anymore. So you can only find that community in Sri Lanka. And then about 300 years later, in 100 BC, some people from the southern tip of India, from Tamil Nadu, came down. So there's 2 major ethnic groups in Sri Lanka. There were some tribes people there, indigenous tribes people, even before that, the Balangoda tribes people, but they disappeared, over 1,000 years ago. They either were killed or, intermarried and no longer survive really as a separate group. So you have these 2 groups, and they, I won't say battled exactly, but they coexisted a lot of the time, with occasional forays where one guy who ran one of the teeny tiny little kingdoms decided he wanted more of his neighbor's stuff and invaded that teeny tiny kingdom. At one point, one of them managed to conquer the entire island. So very briefly, there was one person who ruled all of Sri Lanka, but mostly it was a bunch of smaller groupings, mostly with the Tamil people in the north and the Sinhalese people settling the south. The proportions are about 30-70. There are some other groups. So there are some smaller groups of Muslims. And in fact, there are even some Chinese people and others, which I'll get to, who came later. So eventually, after 1,500 years or so, various European colonizers showed up at the island. They came along the trade routes. I mean, they came earlier and traded, but eventually we were colonized by the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British. Interestingly, they all behaved very differently. So the Portuguese, when they came, they brought Catholicism. If you converted to Catholicism, then your kids did better, had a better shot at going to the good schools and getting the good government jobs. So my many great-grandparent, they would have been Hindu, but they converted to Catholicism. So my family has been Catholic for many generations as a result of this. The Dutch, when they ruled Sri Lanka, they had a pretty light hand in that sense. They were not so interested in bringing any particular religious culture or anything like that. And they actually did a lot of intermarrying. So if you are familiar with Michael Ondaatje, who wrote the book that got made into the film, The English Patient, which is a beautiful book, beautiful film. He is what's called the Sri Lankan burger class, B-U-R-G-H-E-R. I know it sounds like the burger you eat, but it's not. And those are the descendants of Sri Lankans who intermarried with the Dutch. So a mixed race group, often pretty wealthy. And if you're looking for a great book to read, my actual favorite of his is a memoir he wrote called Running in the Family, in which he talks about things like his wealthy, eccentric grandmother who would do things like, if she went to the park and she needed to pee, she would just lift her sari and, crouch down and go for it. And she was so rich that no one was going to say anything to her. It's just kind of wacky. So it's a really interesting kind of like personal view into this tiny, somewhat powerful community. So I don't know, I really enjoyed it. And it's beautifully written. His prose is great. The English Patient is also beautifully written. He wrote a book about the war, Anil's Ghost, which I do not love as much. It's not my favorite book about the war. So I'm like, I was a little frustrated by that one. So, and then after the Portuguese and the Dutch, we got the British. And the British did all kinds of things in Sri Lanka. They built the railroads, which are helpful. they did various not so helpful things. And, all of these groups, of course, were primarily there to make profits, right? The British in India were actually, mostly it was the British East India Company, right? They had a larger standing army than the country, than the British nation at that point. And if you can, I don't know, I think of them like those military contractors in the Middle East, right? Where their main job was to make as much money as possible. So, and we're pretty ruthless in their methods. So, so that's often what you have in a few. I'm going to try to avoid going off into my Kipling rant, but I have complicated feelings about Rudyard Kipling, and he had complicated feelings about being a colonial administrator in India. He has a poem, The White Man's Burden, that is actually about America and the Philippines, which is a really interesting kind of take on colonialism. And he has a short story, The Man Who Would Be King, that was made into a pretty good short film that I would recommend to you, which is about two white guys who come to India and decide they want to be kings, and they go off to conquer this tribe with their guns, and they succeed, but then they basically get themselves killed because they're such fools. So it's a great short story and a good film. So anyway, that's my little Kipling thing. I'm gonna not talk about him anymore. I could talk about him at length. So what you end up with, to bring it back to the food, what you end up with, because you did not sign up for my post-colonial lit class, what you end up in Sri Lanka is all of these crossing cultures, right? So you get certainly a lot of Indian influence, but you also get, through the trade routes, a lot of the flavors of Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore. If you have something like a Malaysian roti with yellow curry, that's honestly very similar to some of the things we eat. If you eat a lot of Thai food, which is rich in coconut milk, that's something we do a lot of. More so, I think, than in, let's say, northern India, right? We use similar spices, and I will say it's true that probably on average, Sri Lankan food is spicier than you would find in, say, northern India. And my personal pet theory, I have no evidence for this, but I think the peppers just grow hotter there because they have a longer growing season. We're basically on the equator. And as someone who tries to grow peppers in Oak Park, it's a challenge. Even if I start my seedlings early and baby them for many months, I will be lucky if we get a season long enough for me to actually harvest peppers at the end of it. So they don't really get a chance to get super big and super hot. So maybe I'll figure out a good greenhouse setup at some point. But I think that's why we tend to have spicy food. But so you have all of those South Asian and Southeast Asian influences, but then you also have the colonizer influences. So, for example, we have a dessert called caramel pudding, which is flan. It is completely just Portuguese flan. It's the exact same thing. And it's sort of funny that we call it caramel pudding. We also have a version of it called vatalappam, which is made very similarly. You make a custard and then you bake it in a water bath to set. But we make it with coconut milk and with our spices. So if you like flan and you're like, ooh, I would like a coconut milk vegan version. Well, actually, it's way not vegan because I think it has eggs in it, but a non-dairy version with South Asian spicing, then you could try making vatalappam. If you look at something like Dutch food in Sri Lanka, you will see things like frikadels, right, which are meatballs, but we will make the meatballs, these Dutch force meatballs, and we'll fry them, but then we'll put them in a curry sauce. They are delicious. That one is really good. We'll also make things like Scotch eggs, where you take, ideally, like I like making them with quail eggs, little hard-boiled quail eggs, and then you wrap the meat around it, and then you deep fry it. and those are delicious. You could also put those in a curry as well. We have some roast meat dishes that are Dutch influenced. There's something called beef s'more, which is a Dutch influenced thing where you are basically making a Sunday roast, but you're also making a curry sauce so that when you finish it, you're slicing the roast and then you're serving it with, you've basted it in the sauce, but you're also serving it with this bowl of a rich curry sauce that you would then drizzle over your slices of roast meat on a plate or as part of a sandwich, etc. That's really good. For British food, we probably have the most influence from the British. They are the most recent and have been around for a while. And so, you know, at Christmas time, we make fruitcake. It's really good. Americans, I'm sorry, don't know how to make fruitcake. Our fruitcake is, you know, moist. We make it, you know, you start it on Stir Up Sunday, you feed it with rum every week, or not, you know, some whatever, brandy, whatever alcohol you like. And, you know, by the time Christmas rolls around, it's had 6 weeks of that, and it's dark and moist and rich and fabulous. And you can only have small bits of it, and I will like sneak into the fridge and carve off little extra bits because it's so good. And that's very similar to not only the British fruitcake, but the British plum pudding is essentially the same thing, except a plum pudding is steamed instead of baked. So it's a little more moist and slightly different texture, but very similar ingredients and a similar end result. We also, if you go to Sri Lanka, you can get high tea at all the fancy hotels. And it'll be cucumber sandwiches, it'll be, you know, little cakes. Maybe they'll have a mango cream instead of strawberry cream, but it will look almost identical to what you would see at an English tea house. But they might also have something like fried prawns as an additional delicious treat as part of the tea service. And tea is drunk, you know, in this sort of classic, like with lots of milk and sugar is certainly drunk all over in Sri Lanka. Usually cooked and spiced and so on. So it's interesting. I don't think we call it chai, but we would just, my parents would have just called it tea, but it's very similar to Indian chai. So I'm trying to think if there are any other major British dishes. I think the main things that I think about, but if you look at like the Sri Lanka Daily News cookbook, which was the Daily News was the local paper in the capital city. It's really fascinating to me how many of the dishes are British, right? Like classic, straight up British dishes. Because that cookbook would have been used by upper class folks, upper middle class, by cooks who were serving in British establishments, right? And so they had to be able to make all of that food. So I'm trying to think where my Daily News cookbook is. So that's the Ceylon Daily News. And, you know, throughout, the attention has been to cater to the needs of the greatest number of housewives. Sorry, I love reading the introductions to old cookbooks. I think they're super fascinating, right? The Ceylon Daily News cookery book constitutes a serious attempt to aid the housewives of Ceylon to practice the art of cooking so that, like the quality of mercy, the preparation of palatable dishes will bless her that gives and him that takes. So that just makes me laugh. But when you look at the list of recipes, it's hors d'oeuvres, soups, fish, meat, beef and veal, lamb and mutton, pork, poultry and game. You know, like you know, and then it keeps going, sauces and gravies, puddings and cold sweets, you know, and it's only when you get to chapter 15 that you hit rice, curries, sambals, 16 chutneys and pickles, 17 candy and singlies recipes, 18 Tamil recipes, 19 sweetmeats, and then 20 is Dutch and Portuguese sweets. And then you get jams and preserves, sweets, cakes and cake icing, bread and biscuits, pastry and pastry cakes. 26 is short eats, which is our term for appetizers. So some of those would have been more Sri Lankan, but then you also have ices, beverages, invalid and convalescent cookery. So I feel like this cookbook is a window into a different time. And it, you know, it has toad in the hole. It has, you know, pigeon pie, these very classic things that I think of as British cuisine, boiled mutton, right? So I kind of love it. I'm a little bit of an Anglophile. So it's a little surreal, but also sort of great. Sardine canapes. Anyway, I'm not going to read you the whole cookbook, but it's really fun. Other questions?
Nope.
Just I hope that was interesting. It was a long.
It was good. I want to thank you, but it was very good. I just started doing some curry, so I was curious about how that you put everything together and with the spices and
Yeah.
and blooming the stuff first before you put it in to do the layers. But it's hard sometimes when you've never had the food and you're cooking it to know what it's really supposed to taste like.
Yeah. No, it is a little bit tricky. I would also say, you know, there are shortcuts that I take. So if you look at my cookbook, you know, it is a Sri Lankan American cookbook, right? And so it's meant for an American audience primarily. So I explain things that people would never explain in Sri Lanka, but I also use the shortcuts that my mother used, or not so shortcuts as adaptations. So for example, it was hard to get coconut milk in 1973 Connecticut, right? There were not coconuts around at the grocery store back then, and you couldn't go and buy cans of coconut milk. So if she was making curry that would normally have half a can of coconut milk in it, or, you know, half a coconut, she would have to use cow milk instead. So she would add, and cow milk is not as sweet as coconut milk. So to get the balance of, there's this phrase upapuli, which is salt tang, but it's really salt tang sweet, sini. So you're normally aiming for a balance of those things. And then if it's a spicy dish, also the heat. But to get the right amount of sweetness, you could add a little bit of brown sugar. If you want to buy jaggery, which is sometimes it's easy to find as cane sugar, but the jaggery that tastes really good is the palm sugar jaggery, which is darker, and you have to grate it to get some off this kind of like hard thing. Great, it's sort of like molasses, I guess. It has a depth of rich flavor that's really great. So she could use a little bit of that, but if you're looking for, you know, and typically there would be tomatoes in a lot of these dishes. And so my mom would use ketchup, because if you're trying to, you know, put together dinner in a hurry on a weeknight, feed a family of 5, she got used to looking for things that would make that an easier task. And ketchup is basically just tomatoes chopped up, cooked down with vinegar, salt, and sugar, right? So it's the same ingredients that you could put in as individual ingredients and cook down, but if you put in ketchup instead, it's going to speed up the transition from there to sauce, right? So you might shave 10 minutes off the cooking time, right, by doing so. And it let her use cow milk with that, but have enough sweetness in it from the ketchup that she didn't have to also add additional sugar, which she'd need to do if she was using tomatoes. I hope that makes sense. So my curry is like my basic curry would be make the seasoned onions, add some whole spices, add the chili powder to the level you want, add a little bit of this roasted curry powder for depth of flavor, then put in whatever protein you're going to use, and then salt, ketchup, and lime juice probably, and then milk. Don't scald the milk, right? You want to stir when you add the milk at the end, so that it doesn't scald. I don't know what other word you could use for that. or if you're adding coconut milk, which I would honestly only use coconut milk for a party generally, because it is also more rich. And, you know, most people I know are trying to be a little careful about that kind of thing, but it's very delicious. So for special occasions, you might make a curry with coconut milk. You might make milk rice, which is rice cooked in coconut milk, which we make for New Year's celebrations. Again, it's one of those, you know, to bring good fortune in the year, right? So,
Yeah.
You know, party food, celebration food, probably not everyday food. For everyday, Sri Lankan cuisine is actually really pretty healthy. If you look at like the country food, people eat red rice more than white rice, and red rice is similar to brown rice in its nutritional profile. It's great for people who are, you know, diabetics who are watching their sugars. It's got a, I can't remember what the term is. It digests glycemic index. It has a low glycemic index. Thanks. And I think it tastes better than brown rice. So if you're at a Sri Lankan grocery store, South Asian grocery store, I would check out the red rice if you're interested in that.
Check out red rice.
Yeah,
that's good. I've never heard of that.
Yeah, it's great. And it's, when you say red rice, like people in America tend to think of like there are African preparations and so on, and that's different from our stuff. So you're really just looking for like basmati rice. Red rice is like the base kind of rice, right? Like, or like brown rice. And then they might have multiple varieties of it. And then I think it's got sort of a nice nuttiness. And sometimes I'll do something where I will make a half and half with white rice. So I might put in, you know, half a cup of red rice, half a cup of white rice, and then 2 cups of water, a pinch of salt. And that actually I think is delicious, a little better for you. It's sort of more interesting too. So that's one thing. One of the things I was sort of interested to see the last time I went to the Indian grocery store is that a lot of the mixes that they used to traditionally do with wheat flour, like the dosa mix and so on, they're now offering them with millet or with a mix of grains. I saw one with quinoa, and I think that's really interesting because, of course, these ancient grains are what you would have used back in the old country before the European influences, right? You know, wheat was not a staple crop in South Asia. So if they had grain, it would have been something like millet back in the day, which is generally low glycemic index and high protein and all of that. So, okay.
Which is much better for you.
It is. I mean, I hesitate to say much better for you because I'm sort of like, well, everybody is different. And, you know, I think of my little sister who's very, very thin and like, you know, probably could use, you know, lots of starch. But if you are aiming towards that, then yeah. So I don't mean to be prescriptive. I just want to give people the tools that they can then use to make their own food decisions, right? And what's best for them. So, but I would say that the village cuisine, another thing that you often see, I'm actually coming out in November with a vegan edition of the cookbook. And when I was researching that, I mean, I'm not vegan myself, but it's very easy to adapt Sri Lankan food to vegan. A lot of it is vegetarian already. And one of the things I found when I was looking through older cookbooks is that it was really common to cook rice with lentils, right? As a sort of default. We have a whole host of different lentils. And that's another way that you can, you know, get some immediate protein into the meal. It's more interesting, it's more flavorful. And if you kind of think like, okay, if you're serving rice and curry to your family every night, if you're sort of embedding half a cup of lentils every time, you're probably giving them a more balanced nutritional profile for the meal overall, right? And especially, again, if you're trying to make vegetarian cuisine, a lot of Sri Lankans are Buddhist, a lot of them are vegetarian, not my family, but there's certainly a large population, so there's lots of vegetarian food on the island. And so that's, again, like a really nice way of rounding out the nutrition on your plate, is just mixing some lentils in when you cook. And you just have to use the right kind of lentils, not the ones that you have to soak for a long time in advance, right? So we have red lentils, we have black lentils, we have various ones that cook faster. So,
Marianne, just two questions. One, there is from Kerala, so lots of coconut milk. The food in many ways sounds similar to Sri Lankan food, though maybe with a little bit less of the East Asian influence. Have you had Kerala food, and would you say that they are kind of similar or no?
So I haven't had Kerala food, but from
here.
looking at the recipes, I would say that they are quite similar. Kerala and Goan food actually are like the two areas that I think there's a lot of overlap.
Kerala and which place?
Goa.
Oh, yeah. And then the other thing is, one of the things that I use a lot is curry leaves.
Oh yeah, so I didn't talk about curry leaves.
Okay.
So yes, and my recipe says curry leaves optional, and I didn't include them because it's funny. It's for so long I just had to do without because you couldn't find them, right? So I would, and certainly in much of the country, you still can't find them, right? Except that you can now order them on Amazon, which I have tried doing. It's amazing. They come fresh and good, and you can use them. But that has just been the last few years. So I had to do with that for a long time. And I didn't actually have a chance to go to Pete's and get fresh ones. So I feel like the ones I have are pretty sad at the moment. But yes, in fact, this is all I have in my fridge right now, is one sad little slightly dried out stalk of curry leaves. But I can go to Whole Foods now. I can go to Pete's and get a packet with lots of fresh curry leaves. If I were cooking for a party, that's what I would do. Or if I were just, I'm running low now, so I will probably go and get some more soon. Dried will still work reasonably well. Fresh is better. And so if you have them, you can certainly take a stalk or two of curry leaves and toast them and then grind them into your curry powder, right? Completely optional. Again, I did without it for many, many years, but it is a very specific flavor. There's nothing I've seen like, I saw one recipe.
There's nothing else quite like it.
There's nothing like it. I saw one recipe from a British chef who was like, you know, if you don't have curry leaves, use basil. And I was like, what? You know, like, do not use basil. Leave them out if you don't have it, because there is nothing with that flavor, right? Like basil and thyme don't have the same flavors. Basil and curry leaves do not have the same flavors.
Right? A lot of my cookbooks will say to use bay leaf instead, but there's just
not the same.
There's no point.
No, I would say leave it out. Better to leave it out than to put in a bay leaf, in my humble opinion. So nothing against bay leaves. Bay leaves are great where they belong. So awesome in Mediterranean cuisine, right? So yeah, and if we were making a curry, typically I would put in addition to having some dried in the curry powder, I would have a fresh stalk or two of curry leaves, and I'll just throw in the stalk as is on the stem, because the stem even has flavor, and then you just fish out the stem afterwards, right? Some of the leaves will have broken off, some won't, but the stem is usually easy to find and remove. You don't want to bite into that. So yeah, no, they're great. Thank you for asking. I meant to talk about it. And
no problem.
So if you do decide to do it for this batch, you would use 2 tablespoons of dried curry leaves, toasted dried curry leaves. So yeah, any other questions?
Patel Brothers in this area does carry it.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. Yay. I clearly need to do an expedition to Naperville. It's been a while since I was out there. You guys have a large South Asian population, so I would expect that your grocery stores would be well stocked. So
yes. Marianne, thank you so much. Does anyone have questions? Maybe not.
No. If you're on Facebook, if you think of something later, feel free to ping me there. I pretty much live on Facebook, for better or worse. So, and I'm trying to think if there's anything else to tell you. I don't know. If you're interested in vegan serendib, you can pre-order it at my site. It won't be out until November, but we're actually probably going to do like a soft launch and have some copies early for locals. So we ordered the galleys today. So I'm hoping they'll be here in like 2 weeks, and then we'll see. Hopefully they look good. So
Yeah. Well, congratulations. I didn't know that was
I'm
coming out.
excited. I'm
Yeah.
excited. So thank you for having me. This
You're
was
welcome.
fun.
Thank you so much for doing this. Thank you everyone for coming this evening. Recording will be posted in the next couple of days. And have a good night, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye,
Bye.
Mary Ann.
Thank you very
Bye.
much. Take care.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.